I want to share with you in this video a little snapshot of my journey as an artist. Again, how I sort of progressed from, someone who I feel like was struggling with all of those questions and issues that I talked about in the last video, up until kind of, now where I feel like I have some of those things under control, or at least I know kind of if I'm struggling with a particular area like that, I know kind of how to improve my skill set, right? I have sort of tools that help me figure out, how to get that knowledge. So, as part of this, I'm going to, share, again, the challenges I faced and, the main ones I think that are really kind of held me up. And, if there are things that potentially resonate with you, I'll give you, again, my sort of tips essentially to combat that. So anyway, let's get started. I really, again, started with, dealing with all of those issues, right? That issue is sort of detail, right? I was really struggling to get detail happening when I was starting out. And I didn't have a reliable sort of process or way of making images. So I was, a professional, I was getting sort of some work, but I was, I certainly was struggling to get the sort of the higher quality sort of work that I wanted. And, I would sort of get that sort of classic feedback comment that, again, I still remember it because it's so sort of emblematic of that thing where, again, I'd sort of post some work up on the internet and people would be like, "Oh, wow, that's cool. Can't wait till you finish it." And I'd be like, I finished it, like that's it. That's all I need to do. That's all I know how to do. Right. And I was always struggling with that, and a big part of that was, I feel like my art sort of inspirations were often the sketchier artists, I mean, one of my favorite, manga is, Blade of the Immortal by Hirokai Sumura. And, he's like a really sort of sketchy artist. And I was a huge fan of sort of Frank Frazetta. And, like all these artists who kind of had this sketchy style. And again, like my sort of question was like, why is their sketchiness better than my sketchiness, that was a huge challenge, right? So I was struggling with that a lot. And, I would just get very sort of unreliable results, right? So, sometimes things would work and sometimes they wouldn't, right? And I kind of felt like at that point, I was like, look, I don't need to give up, right? I don't need to have a plan B. I never really had a plan B. I was just kind of, sort of blindly persistent with it. But, I was like, well, yeah, there's, I feel like I'm getting some good response, but, at the same time, I didn't feel like I was professional. I didn't feel like I really knew what I was doing. And I would sort of, have a lot of stress associated with the creative process, right? It's quite stressful and I kind of like doing it, but also I had some negative relationship to it. So, you can kind of see, again, there was sort of, I feel like I was often making things kind of work by being a little bit sketchier. And I think artists kind of like that. But typically in a commercial environment, we need a higher level of polish, or at least, you'll often get asked to do that, right? So, I'd always get asked like, oh, that's sort of great, but the art direction comment was like, yeah, but can you do another pass on it, right? Can you make this look better, right? And I just didn't know how, and so I would sort of vacillate, right? So, and as I sort of progressed, right, I feel like I did get a little bit better at that. So these are sort of in that 2003, 2004 range, where I was very, very early on sort of trying to be a freelancer. Again, these are sort of just personal things I was doing. Again, working on my folio. I feel like that sort of did get a little bit better, but I was still struggling with, many of these issues, right? I was sort of figuring out, some different stylistic approaches. Again, trying to kind of, perfect my sort of sketchy style, right? And, again, I felt like it would sort of, I'd be able to sort of get it to sort of look good, but then it really relied on me, sort of leaving stuff in a sort of a slightly unfinished state. And I feel like, again, a lot of people were sort of expecting that I knew how to finish it. And I just didn't, I just kind of was like, yep, but that, and again, like the more I kind of, tried to smooth out the brush strokes or sort of get rid of that, again, the sort of energy that I would have in the brush strokes and in the looseness, this sort of thing, people would sort of view that as like, oh, that's a cool sketch, but I really didn't know how to do anything more, right? And every time I kind of said like, oh yeah, okay, I'll clean this up, it just kind of looked mushy and terrible, and it lacked energy, So I was very much one of those people where, the sketches were looking good and everything else was kind of like not as good, right? So again, I was a little bit lost there, and I was sort of still working, at that. But I feel like, what really happened to me that sort of made me turn that corner was, that I sort of got a job drawing comics, right? So I sort of managed to, I sort of, got that happening. And that was like, again, just one of these sort of blind luck sort of things that happened. But I feel like that was really the thing that sort of propelled me on from that, sort of in that sort of, on from sort of 2005 onwards, and allowed me to learn how to draw better and start to solve some of these problems. But it was basically like I just got placed in this crucible, right? And again, if you sort of understand the metaphor or the reality of the crucible is the thing where you basically like burn down all the impurity. You dump a bunch of rocks in there, right? And it burns out all the impurities and gives you like, the good stuff, right? But it's not fun, right? I basically got... I got forced to learn how to draw, right? Because I'd sort of agreed to do this big sort of project. And I feel like that was, again, the best thing that happened for me. But again, I was getting better, but it was still very stressful for me, right? At that point. And I was sort of having, sort of some luck sort of creating these larger scenes. But, the backgrounds were quite a challenge for me. I was sort of good at doing sort of faces and characters and stuff, but the challenge of comics is, you got to draw characters and faces at different sizes, and and then everything's got to have a background in a French comic, right? And I feel like, again, I was sort of getting to the point where I could kind of put those together. I'd learned a bit of sort of perspective, and I'd sort of done a little bit of sort of foundational stuff. But really, I was sort of mostly just focusing on like style and, like just getting sort of pushed into getting good at drawing by practicing, right? I just sort of had to draw all day, every day, because I was drawing comics. But again, I was still not getting my work to like that really high professional level, which is not to say that I wasn't, getting some jobs that were sort of, making me sort of do that. I mean, I think this is like a really good example of that where... and I think this was actually sort of published. It was a marketing illustration to advertise a trading card game, and it was like a real significant thing. But again, I got like multiple requests to again add more detail, and the poor art director sort of people we were working with, you know what I mean. I think again they were probably just thinking like. What's wrong? Like, why is, what's going on here? And I was still struggling with that, right? So I was able to sort of manage a few of these things, and my process was kind of developed to the point where, I could sort of figure out how to create a complicated illustration like this. And I was sort of learning, like, how to sort of make it look like in a particular way. But, really at the end of the day, I was sort of struggling, right? And doing these things it was quite a challenge, right? On every level. And, that's just, a big part of kind of, what was happening then. But, it was happening and things were sort of progressing. But you can see that, again, I was sort of vacillating between different sort of styles and still trying to sort of find my way. And I think, again, at this point, if I sort of look back at the process there, I didn't have like a really sort of professional process either, right? So I was sort of handing up sketches that were probably too rough. I think that was probably like hurting me from, again, getting like more work, right? So, they'd kind of be like, oh, that was kind of okay, but we had to, we had to ask multiple times for, more revisions, to make it look better. And I would kind of, again, do the thing that I feel like a lot of artists sort of fall into in that instance where, someone asks for a detail pass and I would just kind of be like, oh, I don't really know what to do, but maybe if I had a shine to everything, if I had specular highlights to everything, if I just sort of make stuff brighter and keep pressing the contrast button in Photoshop, hopefully the art director will go away and stop telling me to, that it needs more. But I didn't really have a strong understanding of like, how to solve the problems that were coming at me in a professional environment, right? Which again, probably, through word of mouth and that sort of stuff was not really helping my cause, right? So, again, which is to say probably if I did a really good job of that, I might have gotten a few more jobs, right? Whereas, I was probably on the other end of that. And I do feel like, at some point I started to start to solve some of these problems. And I sort of had a few solutions. But again, I feel like even though I was sort of creating the illustrations that again, I felt like had, they had backgrounds, they had multiple elements, and I was really starting to figure out how to put that together. My sort of default way of dealing with the idea of people requesting more detail or wanting more stuff was to kind of just like put stuff everywhere, right? So I'd be like, well, maybe if I just put like grass brushes everywhere and, have like just leaf brushes and just put a whole bunch of stuff there, maybe people will like stop bugging me and telling me that my stuff doesn't look finished, right? Which, again, I don't think is the best sort of way to go about it, right? The other thing that was sort of happening here is, again, I was sort of playing with the idea of having painted backgrounds with a more comic book style character over the top. And again, just sort of vacillating with style a lot, right? Like not really sure of, who I was. And, again, a lot of my stuff, even though most other people would kind of, say, oh, that all looks the same, man. Like, to me, it was kind of, I was really sort of struggling with that. And again, I'd find some things that would work, but I would feel like often they would take me too long, right? So I'd be working in comic books and, I'd sort of get a style that kind of I liked, from a sort of a process and a patience level. But again, the sort of publisher would be like, no, it needs more detail, and so I'd sort of freak out and then, end up doing this kind of stuff, right? So I was very limited in my ability to solve problems, right? And I think that's often one of the things that happens, right? We sort of get like, we get sort of trained to solve problems in a particular way. And I kind of knew how to like, again, hit the problem with the, add more leaves and grass brush sort of solution. And I had more tricks than that, right? But it really felt like I was sort of in the trick level, right? I would look at other sort of stuff and I'd be like, I don't really know what they're doing that's sort of different to me. And I feel like like again, it sort of did progress, and I figured out some of the main stuff, right? My drawing got better. Do you know what I mean? Obviously, from this point forward as well. But I feel like it was sort of in that sort of like a little bit later when, again, through doing a lot of comics and really pushing my ability to draw small and work the thumbnails and really understanding that was an important part. I feel like I was able to get sort of my my professional sort of process to a point where, I was able to hand up the thumbnails and then execute on the thumbnail, which was a big challenge, right? I feel like that was a huge challenge for me in the beginning. I'd be able to do the sketchy thumbnail, right? But then it was like, I don't really know how to make that into a finished painting, and when I did it personally, I'd often change things or modify things, and I would just be very intuitive in the way I did it, which again is like the bad type of intuitive from a professional standpoint, right? So it worked for personal work, but again, I was having trouble getting that same quality and feeling in my professional work. And you can see here again that it's still at this point I was sort of trying to paint stuff because that was either the style that was required from the client, or just because I felt like that's kind of what I needed to do. Although these days, right, I've sort of moved a little bit away from that and more towards, again, using a more typical sort of line and color style. But again, by the time sort of 2011 sort of rolled around and I was sort of, finishing the, the cover for my sort of book, I really, at that point, that's when I sort of, was able to say, okay, like, here's the cover, let's mock it up, this is what it's going to look like, right? And then to kind of, again, create something that sort of looked pretty much exactly like that, just sort of, more detailed and obviously in color and stuff like that. So again, it was a long journey going from sort of, and really it was kind of, probably like a good solid 10 years of me, trying that through sheer force of will, right? And just having to draw a lot through comics and, failing a lot. Which again, I feel like is the experience of a lot of people, right? And that's a perfectly sort of fine way to do it. But I feel like, again, it wasn't until probably even sort of later on that I started to figure out, again, how to solve some of these problems and how to get that flexibility. And again, I feel like, how to sort of stay a little bit more true to my style. So, I feel like the top three things that I feel like I was really sort of doing that really kind of stopped me getting better faster, right? So again, the goal is, hopefully you can get better quicker than that, right? I think, again, the proliferation of art educational stuff on the internet means that people can get a lot better quicker than sort of I did, right? But the things I felt like I was really sort of, again, not getting right in retrospect, the first is that I was kind of jumping styles, right? And I didn't really know who I was, and I didn't really have confidence in who I was or what I sort of wanted to do, right? If you see a lot of the other sort of work that's a little bit more sort of recent that I've done, you can see, I really have sort of actually returned to a lot of the sort of stylistic bents that that the sort of styles and feeling that I was actually working on, sort of 20 years ago, right? And a lot of the techniques and processes that I actually employ are just sort of more advanced versions of the really simple, like, do a line drawing and then put color underneath it, and I'd always sort of look back at that and I'd be trying to paint stuff because I felt like I sort of needed to, that someone was expecting me to do that. But yeah, I kind of look back and I'd be like, actually, this other stuff I was doing sort of looked better, And what I've sort of realized is, certainly, I do, I do sort of, paint illustrations and stuff like that for sort of, capital W work. But really, the thing that I'm interested in and the thing that people tend to respond the best to from me, I feel like is the stuff that is, sort of line and color style, right? That's kind of what I've done. And again, it took me a long time to realize that and to sort of focus on, instead of sort of saying, hey, all of my sort of concept art, artists that I really aspire to and are getting lots of really awesome jobs and stuff, they all sort of paint, right? Because that's how they're sort of trained. And I kind of have this comic book thing and that's not the same. So I just need to learn to paint. And I was kind of doing that and I was just pouring heaps of energy into that and not really thinking about the other stuff, right? So spending huge amounts of time sort of learning different techniques like that. And I think, again, when I sort of had more success is when I just sort of say, I just really dedicated to myself to saying, well, this is the style that I sort of have, and this is the kind of stuff I've always actually wanted to do. And this is sort of what I seem to be good at. Let's just try and do that faster, because I can draw pretty fast because I've been drawing comics for so long, and just kind of see if I can sort of draw as fast as the concept artists, and that's kind of what I did. I really just worked on that skill, right? Worked on my strengths as opposed to my weaknesses for a while. And I felt like that, helped me, immensely, right? And I think there's a lot of that sort of happening, right? Is me just not necessarily sort of knowing who I was and trying to sort of, have these different styles and blend this kind of painterliness and sort of line art stuff. And again, with all of these things, that there's no sort of right or wrong to it, right? I don't regret any of this stuff, but that's just my sort of observation of it. I think it's, again, really important to commit to a sort of a style that you like and spend some time really thinking about that because, in my experience, there's things I like doing and there's things I don't like doing. And there's ways my brain sort of tends to function. And I really found that hasn't changed. It hasn't changed in 20 years of me doing this, right? Or 25 years of me like aspiring to do this, being like a kid in high school and drawing and being like, oh, maybe one day I'd like to draw comics. the things I really like haven't changed that much, right? And the way my patience level really hasn't changed that much. So I think it's really useful, again, to commit to a style that is, again, something that you're interested in, and try and find a way to kind of make that work from a career standpoint sort of afterwards, right? Or at least have that as something in your mind, right? Again, like, I can do all these sort of different things. I can, paint, stuff and make it look a particular style, and I can kind of match styles and do all this kind of stuff. But again, that's not really the stuff that people know me for, or I think care about as much. So I think that's a huge part of it. So I think the other thing that obviously is a huge sort of thing is again what you'd hear from most people, right? Which is just, I didn't commit to foundation sort of early on enough. And this is a real sort of trap for people who are sort of self-taught, right? Is I would sort of be getting good results, right? And I'd be progressing a little bit. But again, I was kind of hitting these imaginary brick walls and, these sort of glass ceilings and all these kind of weird things where I'd be like, I don't really understand what's going on. And I really think most of that was just foundation, right? Not really committing to proper sort of foundational study. It is quite challenging, though, if you're teaching yourself to kind of motivate yourself to do that sort of, hardcore perspective and your sort of basic sort of rendering exercises and all those things that people sort of talk about when they say makes up foundation. But I certainly, didn't commit to that early enough. And it was really only through luck of me actually, wanting to draw comics and then sort of being forced through that I kind of got like like a street version of foundation, because it was just like, you have to draw these things and you just get so much practice doing it. So I'd recommend either commit to foundation or just draw a bunch of comics, right? I think that's a really good way to, again, sort of make this go faster. But again, make sure you focus on what's important, right? I don't think you can smash out foundation and work, all day, every day at foundation and then be like, okay, dust yourself off and then just carry on your merry way. I think it's more like, we sort of commit to foundation, again, as part of our long-term journey, as part of our journey towards mastery that's going to take, multiple decades of sort of hard work. And we just keep getting better and better and better at it, right? I think it's better to make it sort of, like a daily little practice, right? As opposed to sort of, again, trying to sort of spend your whole life for a couple of years, just doing perspective and rendering stuff. And thirdly, again, I feel like I really sort of, I fell for a lot of the stories that I think, people were sort of telling about sort of deifying our sort of art gods, right? We often sort of call our art gods. And, I feel like a lot of the books I read very early on, sort of had this image of the artist that they were representing, right? Because there wasn't that many people that had books, and all these people were kind of, quote unquote famous. But, part of that process is really sort of not sort of saying, hey, this person worked really hard. People tended to have this sort of attitude of like art as a talent thing. And I did still have this kind of feeling that like, surely just me working on my foundation is not going to help that much. You know what I mean? There's like, there's things that are really personal about you, and, you're kind of just like built a particular way. And what I found is that, like, honestly, this just takes time. Everyone's mortal. And if you actually sort of talk to people, that's sort of the consistent narrative story that you get. But I think there's a lot of sort of, again, like really looking up and deifying, artists that are amazing. And I feel like that's just not helpful, right? It's really important to understand that, this just takes time. I think it takes everyone time to get sort of good, and hopefully you can do it a little bit quicker than me. But again, that there's nothing wrong with doing it, any particular way. I learned a lot of weird sort of things, and how to do different stuff that kind of helps me now. But that's just a little bit about my journey and things that I've sort of learned. Hopefully you can, again, just get a bit of a better idea about, where I'm coming from. And hopefully some of those tips can help you out and again, frame some good thoughts and positive thoughts about how this sort of journey might go for you. But again, you can do it. It's easy. It's just a lot of work, right? Anyway, so in the next few videos, I'm going to jump directly into talking about those sort of 4 issues or questions that I sort of brought up initially. And yeah, we'll just basically sort of tackle them one by one and look at kind of how we can improve or solve those issues. We'll catch you in the next video. Thanks for watching and hanging out.